Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Nick Neely. I'm an assistant professor of English writing at Eastern Oregon University. Welcome to the Sandra and Carl Elston Ars Poetica Fund reading and conversation featuring journalist, essayist, and novelist Ben Ehrenreich. As people settle in, I'm going to drop a few notes and links into the chat. I wanted to direct everyone to our Ars Poetica reading series landing page, where announcements for future events and video archives are posted. We expect to announce 6 events for the winter and spring terms by early January, so please stay tuned for that. You can also now subscribe to our YouTube channels, and our Ars Poetica YouTube channel, and follow the English Writing Program on Twitter for the latest. Finally, I'm going to drop a link to Ben's latest book, the topic for today, Desert Notebooks, which I encourage you to check out and or buy. It's a really fantastic read. So here come these items. As we begin, I wanted to offer just a brief land acknowledgement, since many of us, some of us, are here in La Grande, where EOU is sited. We humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land Eastern Oregon University is upon, the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Nez Perce people. We celebrate their traditions, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to this land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeastern Oregon. And now it's a real pleasure to introduce Ben Ehrenreich, who is beaming in from Spain. It's later in the night for him. Thanks for making time, Ben. As I mentioned, Ben is going to share from his most recent book, Desert Notebooks, A Roadmap for the End of Time, which was a New York Times notable book of 2020. Among much other praise, the writer William Atikins wrote of Desert Notebooks in the New York Times Book Review that it is startlingly original, out of love and despair. Where else does art come from? He has built a potent memorial to our own ongoing end times. Ben writes about climate change for the nation, and his work has appeared in Harper's Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, the London Review of Books, and Los Angeles Magazine. In 2011, he was awarded a National Magazine Award. His previous books include Palestine, include one of the Guardian's best books of 2016, The Way to the Spring, Life and Death in Palestine, based on his reporting from the West Bank. He's also the author of 2 novels, Ether and The Suitors. For just a little bit more on Desert Notebooks, here it is. Here's how the publisher Counterpoint Press describes it. Desert Notebooks examines how the unprecedented pace of destruction to our environment and an increasingly unstable geopolitical landscape have led us to the brink of a calamity greater than any humankind has confronted before. As inhabitants of the Anthropocene, what might some of our own histories tell us about how to confront apocalypse? And how might the geologies and the ecologies of desert spaces inform how we see and act toward time? The past we have erased and paved over, this anxious present, the future we have no choice but to build. Ehrenreich draws on the stark grandeur of the desert to ask how we might reckon with the uncertainty that surrounds us and fight off the crises that have already begun. In the canyons and oases of the Mojave and in Las Vegas's neon apocalypse, Ehrenreich finds beauty and even hope surging up in the most unlikely places, from the most barren rocks and the apparent emptiness of the sky. Desert Notebooks is a vital and necessary chronicle of our past and our present, unflinching, urgent, yet timeless and profound. I would have to agree with that description. It's a really vital book, and I'm so excited to be able to talk about it today. Ben's going to read from Desert Notebooks for a bit, and then we'll have a conversation before opening it up to your questions. At any point, please drop your questions or use the Q&A button via Zoom to ask your questions, and we'll get to them there. And with that, welcome, Ben. So pleased to have you.
Thank you, Nick, for that very kind introduction. Thanks for having me. And thank you, all of you who are tuning in whom we can't see. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Desert Notebooks. It is not like any other book that I've written before. And in some ways that makes it a hard book to introduce and to give you a sort of quick taste of. Because as I'm sure we'll talk about over the course of the next hour, it's a book that draws its momentum from many different places and many different ideas. That's about not just one place and not just one position in time. As the title suggests, it's a book about the desert, but also as the subtitle suggests, it's about time and the end of time and the shapes that time takes and why we experience it the way we do. It's also very much a book about writing and about what value writing might have in a world that seems to be falling apart. It might make things a little clearer if I preface this by saying that I started writing it in late 2017, a little more than a year after Trump's election. I know these last 2 years have been weird and painful ones, and it's sometimes hard to remember that one was really weird and painful too. The dizzying pace of the crises, the revelations, the outrages, the scandals, sometimes several in the course of a day. We weren't used to any of that yet in the US. And we were just beginning to get used to it when COVID hit and time seemed to break down once more. But in those days, it felt all too fresh. Not only political certainties, but our very grip on time itself seemed to be slipping away. So I tell the story in the first chapter of the book. I was at the time living in Joshua Tree in California in the Mojave Desert. And I went out for a hike with two friends. I'll read you a little bit from that brief introduction. The summer had passed. The monsoons had poured down in September, and though no rain had fallen since, the senna and brittle bush were still in bloom, smearing the sides of the wash a brilliant yellow. I don't remember what we were talking about. Maybe Steve Bannon or the Lost Hikers or Roy Moore banned from the mall. Remember Roy Moore getting banned from the mall? Or the elusive scent of the desert willows that thickened the floor of the wash. When Kay, walking ahead of A and me, stopped, she pronounced a single word: owls. They took to the air in a sudden rustling burst and then went silent. I barely glimpsed the first one, a flash of wide white wings as it glided by above us, too big a thing to be so quiet. It soared off in a broad arc and disappeared behind a hill to the west. The second one, though, passed low enough that for an instant I could see its flat, tawny face, the mottled white and brown plumage of its belly, those bright alien eyes. It circled once and flew out of sight to the east. Eventually, we breathed. With all their circling and swooping, Kay thought maybe there had been 3 of them, but I was fairly sure there were just 2. We kept walking, the wash narrowing as we went until we had to scramble over boulders to proceed. We turned a bend. The owls were there, perched on a rock. They saw us first and flew off up the canyon. Again, they separated, one arcing right, the other left. I know at some point we talked about Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, Saad Hariri's strange flight to Riyadh, Jared Kushner's visit the week before. All of that had filled me with a panic that lasted for days, the contours of the next global conflict revealing themselves, requiring only the smallest flame. Who would play the role of the Archduke? Who would play the role of the Archduke this time? And who would kill him? Kay stopped again. The owls had roosted in the rocks ahead of us as if they were waiting for us there. They flew off again and we watched in silence. So it went. We scrambled on, following the canyon as it twisted left or right, expecting to see the owls at every bend. Every 100 yards or so, we caught up with them, and everything we'd been saying felt suddenly impertinent, and we fell silent until they flew off, and then walked on until we caught up with them again. We talked more quietly now, still surveying the crises of the day, pausing to admire a paper bag bush in unlikely late autumn bloom, or a particularly bold and healthy cholla. And then the owls shut us up again. We saw them 5 times in all, maybe 6, before they soared off into some more distant canyon and disappeared for good. I knew that we'd been annoying them, that they were only trying to avoid us. And it's foolish, I know, but this is what humans do. We turn the world into a story and put ourselves at the center of the plot. And I found it hard not to imagine or to want to believe that they'd been leading us onward all along, that they were trying to tell us something, or to show us a path, one that led deeper into the wilderness, away from the highway, away from the car. So that should give you a little idea of what's at stake in this book, and what is, I think, at stake for all of us. It may sound grim. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to read another paragraph. That will tell you what's at stake. Okay. Away from the highway, away from the car. Before we said goodbye that night, in the parking lot of the town's one Indian restaurant, the conversation turned to writing. A and K are both writers. It was getting harder, we agreed, to muster faith in any of it, to care at all about lit world battles that had once seemed so important, or even in the face of real planetary disaster, glaciers melting, oceans rising, droughts and fires and famines and floods, to care about something we had once confidently called literature. No matter how pointless things may have felt at any given moment, A said, you could always tell yourself that you were taking part in a conversation, an exchange that stretched back into the immeasurable past and into a future that you couldn't yet imagine. That was the conceit. Not progress, but continuity at least. You could tell yourself that it was the conversation that mattered, the stream of voices flowing through the centuries, this ancient, almost sacred thing that is bigger and deeper than any of us alone. But what if it's going to end soon? What if someone in a generation, perhaps two, will write the very last word? What if the future does not include enough human beings to keep the conversation going? What if it drifts off like a party at the end of the night with only a few drunks left mumbling in the corners? What if the humans who remain are too busy surviving to tend to the books and the servers? What if literacy has a horizon and it's near? Isn't it all just noise then? I should add that we were laughing, or smiling at least. Okay, so that should give you an idea of what's at stake in this book. And as grim as that may sound, it didn't feel grim at the time, and I don't think this book is either. So I'm going to jump ahead. Really, I mean it when I say that we were smiling. We were talking about the end of time and the increasingly probable destruction of everything we knew and loved. We didn't relish any of it, but in the context of the walk we had just taken, time took a different shape. The desert enforces its own perspective. It shrinks you and puts eternity in the foreground. If you're open to it and don't mind a diminished role in the drama, it insists quietly on the surging beauty of all things and non-things living and dead and not formally alive. So something still stranger happened that evening. I drove home feeling this almost ecstatic sense of gratitude, though I didn't really understand what I felt so goonily thankful for. I went to bed, I woke up, I worked on whatever I was working on then, and a week or so later, I remembered that walk and I sat down to write about it, basically as a journal entry. It was like my sort of warm up before I started writing what I thought really mattered for the day. And I basically kept writing for the next 12 months. That's only barely an exaggeration. I have been working on a novel, which I tended to get back to, and I still haven't returned to it. Instead, I wrote what became Desert Notebooks. The process of writing it was also very much a process of reading and of writing as I read. Those owls sent me to the Quiche Maya text, the Popol Vuh, in which owls play a role, then to the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, to Hegel, the German philosopher, and again to the German Jewish critic Walter Benjamin, as well as to the Greek myths and to stories told by the people who lived in the Mojave before Europeans arrived, the Chemehuevi, the Serrano, the Moabi, the Odom, who are of course still there. And later it brought me to the extraordinary work of a scholar named Martin Bernal, Black Athena, which is about the way European scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries scrubbed their understanding of ancient Greek civilization, of all of its links to Africa and Asia, and constructed thereby an ethnically cleansed mythology of Western origins. And when people talk these days about Western civilization and about white Americans as the inheritors of the glories of Western civilization, as Trump often did, and as his many offspring and bedfellows still do, it is precisely that ethnically cleansed and entirely fictional mythology that they're referring to. And my investigations about time, I began to understand, were not just about this experiential sense that time was breaking down, but about understanding the roots of that mythology, which is what gave shape to our sense of time and of history itself. So my investigations turned out to be, I didn't expect this would happen at the beginning, about a politics of time and about how time functioned as an ideological instrument. Because time too, I realized, had a history. It existed within time. And the factors that shape our perceptions of time, the rise of capitalism and of theories and structures of racial hierarchy and of white supremacy, are the very same factors driving the multiple crises that are spiraling around us, distorting our sense of time, pushing everything towards collapse and towards something that looks and feels at times a lot like the end of time. Of course, time doesn't end, and if all of this sounds really abstract, because I'm rushing through something that took me quite a while to write and takes almost 300 pages to read, I'll read a little bit more from a later section of the book that should make it a little bit more concrete. And the this of this first sentence is time, history. Until recently, most Europeans bore this burden lightly. Time blazed past according to the rhythms of the plow and the scythe, the wheel of the saints' days and the opportunities for rest and carousal that accompanied them. For all but a minuscule literary elite, the years passed without number. Churches did not trouble to record the years of births, baptisms, and marriages until the 16th century. Common people's lives were ruled by neither days nor hours. The church bells would ring for matins and vespers, but no further demarcation of the time was necessary or even possible. Mechanical clocks only began to appear on church towers in the 14th century, and then only in cities and large towns. For the next 400 years, it would have made little sense to slice an hour into smaller bits. Most clocks did not even have minute hands. If the need arose, time could be subdivided into commonly understood and distinctly human-sized quantities. The time it takes to mow a field of grain, say, to recite an Our Father, or to urinate. An interval known as a pissing while made it into Shakespeare's Two Gentlemen of Verona, as in, he had not been there, bless the mark, a pissing while, but all the chambers smelt him. Over the course of the 17th century, more accurate clocks began to proliferate, and eventually to migrate from town squares and cathedral belfries into the drawing rooms of the gentry. In another 50 years, technology, specifically the development of the balance spring and regulator, allowed clocks to miniaturize without any sacrifice in accuracy and to take refuge in the pockets of an emerging class of merchants and manufacturers. In 1687, 10 years after the invention of the balance spring, Isaac Newton elevated time in an extraordinary fashion, defining it as an absolute and independent force that progressed at a consistent rate regardless of who was perceiving it, or if it was perceived at all. Even if the universe were entirely empty, time would tick on, echoing through the void like God's very pulse. And why not? Any mortals with sufficient income to spare could by then carry time around with them, trapping it in its compact silver case, embossed perhaps with golden stars. Whether its owner was awake or asleep, alive or dead, it would tick and tock for eternity, unless they neglected to wind it. By 1760, the personal timepiece had become sufficiently widespread that a British satirist would complain that, "Sir, will you have your clock wound up?" had become the common expression of streetwalkers. Over the course of the next century and a half, time, once the property of none and all, would belong to the rich and the powerful, first to the factory owners, then the railway magnates, then to the politicians and military men, divvied up according to the needs of capital and conquest. Technology, the British historian E.P. Thompson observed, was never the decisive factor. Though the key orological innovations had occurred decades earlier, the general diffusion of clocks and watches in England did not take place until the 1790s, at the exact moment when the Industrial Revolution demanded an exact synchronization of labor. Large-scale industrialization, Thompson argued, had reconfigured labor. Workers who had once bartered their skills or their strength now hired out their time, They were paid by the day or the hour rather than the task or the piece. In a very literal sense, time became money. It became something wholly abstract, something independent of our bodies, of the circulation of our blood, and the transit of our thoughts and desires. It could be used or misused, spent or wasted, even stolen. Moments of inactivity were suddenly transformed into something that would have been nonsensical a few years earlier, a theft of time that vigilant managers strive to guard against. The ironworks in Swalwell in northeast England, which was for a little while the largest factory in Europe, was the first to employ a monitor tasked with noting every worker's arrivals and departures to the minute, and with guarding the clock to prevent workers from setting it forward or back. Power over time had become power over labor, which is to say, over people. It was at that same moment, which was also the moment of revolutionary upheaval in France and in Haiti, of Condorcet's frenzied ode to human progress, and by many measures, the beginning of the modern era, that with the development of the coal-powered steam engine, the industrializing societies of Europe and North America began releasing sufficient carbon dioxide to eventually alter the climate of the Earth. It was then, too, that the stars began to disappear from the skies of the cities and towns of Europe and North America, and from the consciousness of their inhabitants, smeared away by the smoke of all those factories and by the glow of the gas lamps that in the early decades of the 1800s were beginning to illuminate the streets of European capitals. It was then that time got inside us. So I'll stop reading there, but it gives you a little taste of some of the distances the book travels, and I'm happy to talk about it.
Thanks so much, Ben. Really enjoyed that reading. It's amazing how you put time into time there, making a narrative out of it. And I think reading this book, I think a lot about sort of the connections or the overlap or the possibility that the same thing between time and narrative. Maybe we can get back to that subject. But off the bat, I'm glad you read from the intro. It's a beautiful introduction that puts us in place. And one thing you described that after you took this walk, you felt something like the quote, "The joy of discovery preceded the exploration" for this project. You had a certain mood. You had a compulsion to write about these owls and to see where they led you. I wonder, is this book, which is so disparate and so ambitious and sidewinding, is it a kind of project that you wanted to get to, or is it really something that you didn't anticipate and just grew, just became a monster that grew out of nowhere?
I didn't anticipate it at all. Even while I was writing it, I thought I was crazy. I wasn't at all sure that it was going to come together in any form that would make sense to anyone. I just knew that I had questions that I had to answer, at least to my own satisfaction. And the only way to do that was to do it on the page. So a lot of some of the things that I referred to in the book, because it refers to many other books. And some were things that I read before and was familiar with. I've been reading Walter Benjamin for a long time. Mm-hmm. Certainly Borges, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of it was things that I read for the first time while I was researching this book. Mm-hmm. And sort of simultaneously reading and writing, and kind of figuring out what would I don't even trust the way that I want to talk about it, because it kind of felt like everything I read led me to the next thing, which led me to the next thing, which led me to the next thing, and the connections were kind of making themselves. And it was sort of dreamlike in that. A lot of what we do as writers is really struggling to make connections, and trying to, pull from the world of our experience and our research, sort of desperately find a way to weave a web that makes sense of it. Whereas in this case, I felt like I was just being led along and had this sort of bizarre faith that I would be able to put it all together. And I should say that like there was a very intense, after I did most of the reading and did most of the writing, there was then a very intentional period of structuring and restructuring, which gave it the shape that it has now. But yeah, no, I had it absolutely would not have occurred to me that I was going to write a book about any of the things that this book is about. My previous book had been a much more straightforward work of journalism based on the time that I'd spent living and working in Palestine. And maybe it's because I needed still to, that was an intense enough experience that I needed to do something completely different. And that's probably what had me end up in the desert and thinking about these things.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to hear you talk about how, the writing of a book is its own kind of episode of time that takes on strange shapes, and that you're writing this during a traumatic time, a new president doing radical, sometimes terrifying things, and yet the book itself was its own kind of another container for a time where I find that fascinating. I want to talk, ask more about the way you structured it, but before we get back to that, wondering, what I love about the intro is that you're walking through this canyon. You write, we were following in reverse the path the rain had carved over centuries as it trickled and sometimes raged down from the rocky hills into the flat, sandy basin below. This setup, I think, is great because it really connects time and space. You're sort of walking, figures you and the book as a walk back through time, or through time, not necessarily back. And another thing that's neat about that moment is that as you walk, you're talking politics from and this is in what you read, you're talking politics, you're observing the owls and the desert, this canyon. And these things are woven, they're not separate, and yet the owls sort of quiet the other discussion. And it seems to make a statement about what this book is up to. And I find myself thinking about genre, whether you set out to sort of challenge a traditional work of environmental writing, which can sometimes take the form of a nature walk, or has at times traditionally. Do you think of this project as environmental from the outset, or is that not really a lens you saw it through?
No, not at all. I mean, if I'm honest, I've read more works that fall into the category of environmental writing since I wrote this book than I had before I wrote this book. I didn't think about it. I didn't think that about it as really belonging to any particular genre. It never occurred to me in my life as a writer that I would, people would regard me as a nature writer, which people who only know this book. I mean, I don't think this book is actually really a book of nature writing. I think it's about Las Vegas as much as it is about the desert. It's about, it's all over. Yeah, it simply never would have occurred to me that I'm happy to be in the company of a lot of great environmental writers. I don't rebel against the category, but it wasn't my idea at all. Most of my journal, like I said, I've been living and working in the Middle East before this, and the writing in the desert that I'd done prior to this book, for the most part, had been about the border, and about the militarization of the border and deaths along the border and the vigilante groups that were growing up along the border when I was reporting at the time. And when I was doing that work, I certainly appreciated the beauty of the place that I was in. But in those days, I was much more attentive to the human dramas that were occurring there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think one thing that this book, it doesn't take on genre directly at any time, but it does not fall into any sort of genre seems certainly in keeping with the investigation, the overall argument that you're making in the book. So I don't mean to pigeonhole it, but I think it's it's an expansive view of what environmental writing can be, and is, to my mind, pushing the genre, if there is one, in that capacity. I'm curious if you could, and maybe this relates to what environmental writing sometimes tries to do, is there's a connection you make early and often in the book, between decentering and various ways of decentering and creativity, so that to de-emphasize the self, the human species, and some of our narratives, is really to sort of open up to possibility, and is the only way forward. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about how you see writing as a kind of decentering, or whether you think that strong writing comes from a place of decentering, or is about that. Hopefully that's not...
Yeah, that's a great question, and really well put. I think I guess the way to answer it is say that while I wasn't writing against sort of against the edifice of any existing genre, I certainly was writing against narrative convention, right? And trying, which is something I think I've tried to do in probably in my fiction more than my journalism, but in both, for a long time. Like I think I've thought a lot about and been troubled a lot by the ways that narrative both propels and confines us, and thought a lot about how to, how do you create a work of prose that will bring someone along, that someone's going to want to keep reading, without the kind of narrowing that conventional narrative imposes, the sort of linear structure that conventional narrative tends to impose. So, given that I was, thematically talking about precisely the issues that you just articulated, and decentering the self and decentering our sense of time, I had to come up with a formal structure and approach, which tried to do the same thing, and which didn't attempt to squeeze everything into a single track linear narrative. And that's something I think I've always been interested in doing, in all my writing, and this was kind of the chance to really play and try to make it work. And I think that's the thing that I was probably most scared about as I was putting it together. Like, am I going to be able to create a structure that that doesn't rely on those conventions, but that's still going to make people want to walk alongside me?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does pull you along, and I sort of marvel at how it does it, and how I wonder if you could speak more to some of the strategies that you use to pull these disparate meditations and investigations in literature and history together. I mean, you're really good about bringing up things that you mentioned previously in the text and maybe reinterpreting them, looking at them in a slightly different light, or just pinging them again. The Owls, Borges, Benjamin. Were you, how intentional were you in this? Was this sort of methodical, or was it more organic and natural to the way your thinking and writing was developing? Or were you kind of like, I know I need to bring this back, it will help the book hold together?
I mean, originally it was fairly organic, and then there was a great deal of method went into the final structuring. I had this fellowship in Las Vegas, and was given an office at the Black Mountain Institute. Could not have written this book without their support, I would say. And people would look confused when they'd come into my little office, because I had little index cards like pasted all over an entire wall of the office, and I was always kind of moving them around, trying to figure out where things went and how they could kind of bounce off each other effectively. And then I gave up on it got too big, so I gave up on the index cards and just started moving things around on my computer. But yeah, that was pretty methodical. And I knew that that there are other ways to create tension, other ways to create momentum. By returning, in a more circular fashion to certain themes, and more in the way that like post late 60s jazz does, or something like that, where everything seems to be falling apart, but then it's also kind of pulling you back in and returning, like you get a little snippet of melody and then it falls apart and then you return to it again. And that's kind of what I was aspiring to, is right, like using more musical methods to build momentum, and to kind of hold on to people. So I'm glad you think it worked.
I think it does, and of course, your voice and sensibility, hold it together so well in and of itself. You mentioned that there was a very intentional structuring. You're talking about that. The book in the end kind of looks like this sort of meandering. It's a meandering essay, right? That is linear. Inevitably, you're reading through a book. But I found myself thinking about like the way in which you wrote this, and then you shuffled things. Things fell away. You went in and maybe worked on certain moments. So to think of it as, I started to think about a book, it was cool. I started thinking about a book as maybe a work of time, and like we're not necessarily seeing the fourth dimension that is revision. We're only seeing the myth of the start to finish. Could you talk a little bit more about the kinds of revision that you did, and ultimately, and how you maybe worked with your editor to do that?
Yeah, I mean, revisions were extensive. I think like there was a period of 10 or 12 months where I wrote most of what made it into the final book, and then spent months moving it around, and cutting things. Like there, maybe a couple dozen sections that just didn't make it into the final book, and some of them I really liked, but like they were dragging, and I didn't, I touched that note too many times, didn't need to touch it again. And my partner, Olivia Watson, was my first editor and read multiple versions, and was enthusiastic reader and a strong critic, so was great and helped me a lot. And then my editor at Counterpoint, Dan Smetanka, was a fairly hands-off, although he said with very little else. He said, "It's not done. I think you need to," because the manuscript that I gave to him was just the first two sections. So it doesn't include the final it didn't include the final section where I, after having left the desert, then return. And Dan's like, I think you need a third section to bring it together. I was like, oh God, okay. So I was really happy to go back to the desert and have an excuse to go back to the desert, because I'd been living, I'd left and left the country, and went back there for a few more months, and wrote what became the final section of the book.
I mean, that return makes so much sense, right? Because you're arguing for a non-linear time, a non-messianic time, one that's cyclical. So the return to desert works quite nicely, and in particular, the image that I was drawn to in that epilogue was your visit to the creosote plant, which you visit what apparently is the oldest creosote known, over 11,000 years old, and it's growing as a ring in a nearby valley from where you were staying. And elsewhere, maybe I've got this in my notes somewhere, I'll bring it up. Elsewhere you talk about, let's see, you bring up this great, here's what you write about time. After exploring many different versions for it, you say, this is perhaps a more useful way to think about the shape of time, not as a line or an arrow or a circle or a spiral, but something living, a circle that expands out of sight, invisible roots that grow and grow even as the parts we can see die off. The world, this is a quote from Ursula Le Guin, the world is always new, wrote Ursula, however old its roots. And I love the return to that, the creosote kind of affirms that sense for time. And we also sense that it describes sort of the project of the book, which is like this plant too. So I guess that's more, one of my questions, I'm describing your complex tour through time, trying to, and to what extent has that sense of time sort of stuck with you since then? And it seems like something you genuinely discovered and changed your philosophy of time, evolved in the writing. Is this something that has kind of you've carried forward into new work and into your life? Sorry for the unknown question.
No, it's a great question. I think it has, although, so I left the desert. I moved to the city in which I now live. It's a city. There's a lot of light pollution. You can't see the stars. There's trees in the park, but little that's sort of growing outside of very intentional human shepherding. And I talk about in the book a lot about the stars in the desert and my sense of sort of geologic time, and how a lot of what upended my own sense of time was that experience of living out there for really extended periods, and coming into immediate sensual contact with much deeper non-human forms of time, right? So then I left the desert, and I missed it terribly, and I felt, I live in a great city, but I felt like I was like missing a limb or something. And then 23 months ago, I had a kid. I have a baby daughter, and I was excited about that, but I didn't expect, and you're grinning because you're a dad too. One of the things that it did was it reconnected me in exactly that same way to this kind of deeper sense of time. To my ancestors, to futures that I won't know anything about, and I still miss the stars and whatnot, but there's a way in which being aware of a kind of intergenerational time, in which one's selfhood is also deeply decentered, right? Because that is one of the things that being a parent does to you, is you are definitely not the center of the world anymore. Yeah. And all of that, I think, has weirdly and as a sort of great surprise returned into that. Yeah. And I guess also I think it's a sort of sense of the ways that love can completely like decenter you, the ways that love shifts your sense of time, which was true in the desert too. Yeah. It wasn't the love for an individual child, but for for other things.
Mm-hmm. There's a great line on the last page of your book. If children are another way of telling time, a kind of living clock, then what about the rest of us, a little bit older and further along?
Graying beard as clock.
Yeah, it makes me think in dark ways. One more question for me, and then some from the audience. News watching is such a and responding to the things you're reading in the news and elsewhere is a major thread of this book. You're reading climate change reports. You say that you dread the words new report. It's all bad news. And then you're responding to the rhino, who aka Trump, who you never actually mentioned, and made me think about kind of the synergy, because between your journalism, which you're necessarily watching the news and what's coming out, how people are writing about it, and this totally work that's really not supposed to be in time in some ways, right? It was meant to be more timeless. And can you say more about just kind of the synergy or the push and pull between your journalism and this essay that emerged for you?
I mean, I guess that's something that I've always felt, because I've always, for years I was writing journalism at the same time that I was writing novels, and the novels, didn't exist in the same sort of plane of time as the journalism. But I mean, it was something that was particularly acute for me living in the desert, where at the same time that it's so hard to avoid like the use, like these idiomatic uses of the word time. It's just so aware of them. But I was, intensely aware and shaken and blown away by this kind of time that I hadn't really experienced before. And when I wasn't out staring at the stars or working or hiking, I was staring at my fucking phone, and being tormented by the news, by social media, by the push and pull of events. And on the one hand, it was an extraordinary comfort to be able to have the perspective of a different kind of time, right? Which is not just this too shall pass, right? It's something I think a little bigger than that. But so one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to try to pull those two perspectives together, and to play on the tension that they create. And yeah.
I mean, I think it's really engaging. In nonfiction, I really admire, think hard about books in which the process really is the subject, and you sort of honor and show the process of the book and the writing of it in that way. A couple questions from the audience. The first from an anonymous attendee. How do you account for being carried along as by a dream in the writing of this book, of the connections making themselves? What about this material made that possible? Kind of a dreamy question itself.
Oh man, I can't account for it, except through like appeal to mental illness. I wish I could, because I would do it again, and again and again, because it was, I won't lie, it was like, when you're in the thick of a book and it's really carrying you, it's a wonderful experience. I mean, so much of writing is so masochistic and just drudgery, and I was just talking with my partner about this, who's also a writer, and she's like, it's like an abusive relationship, except you're the only one in it, right? And so no, it was really, in many ways, it was really wonderful. The sort of sense of both of mission, but also that I was being taken somewhere that wasn't really in my control. It was sort of dreamy for me as a writer. And I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to get there again. And if I could, I would. I mean, I'm like thinking about the next book, and it's fun, and I'm excited about it. But it's not that same process. So yeah, I that's not a satisfactory answer to the question, but that's all I can give.
I think it's a good answer to a really challenging question. One more uh, about journalism. Do you have any, this one specifically mentions Harper's, but do you have any recommendations for a writer who wishes to break into magazine writing? Could you talk about, how you got into magazine writing or how you think about it?
I mean, my main recommendation would be go to trade school, like pick up like plumbing, electrician work, anything that people will need and that will pay your bills. And I'm only half joking. And I've at various points through my career wished I had done that myself. Journalism has gotten harder and harder since I started. I mean, I started in I guess it was the late 90s. And at the time, it was actually not that hard to make a living writing for, I wrote for years for LA Weekly, the alternative paper in Los Angeles. And I paid my rent and I lived okay. And I loved my work. And it's not really possible to jump in as a freelancer and live in a American city and survive anymore, because the pay has gotten worse over the years, and the market has gotten worse and worse for writers. So this is not a happy answer to this question, but I would feel like I was not doing you right to give you a kinder answer, to give you a more sunnier answer. But so yeah, the path that I took kind of doesn't exist anymore because the market has changed so much, and the industry has changed so much. That said, if you really want to do it, write and write and write and write. Have another way to pay your bills if you can. Find another way to steadily pay your bills. It didn't used to be. Believe it or not, I decided that I would do journalism as a way to support my fiction writing habit, which is kind of playing violin on the subway to support your watercolor habit or something. But it didn't feel like that at the time, right? It was possible then, but things have changed a bit, and to do journalism too, you have to pay those bills. So that's perhaps a discouraging answer, but other than that, just write. The advantage to the changes in the industry are that there are a million more outlets, and you don't have to just pitch the gatekeeper giant outlets like the New Yorker and Harper's. You can write for much smaller places online, and develop a lot of clips, and develop your craft, and keep doing it. But yeah, figure out how to hang drywall or something too.
And clearly a good idea to keep a journal on the side, because you don't know what's gonna come from that. Maybe I've got one more question before we call it quits, which is that you talk about you're thinking about archaeology and anthropology, and you describe them as colonial and narrative making forces. Speaking of European exportation of antiquities from the Middle East, you write, by expropriating these objects and interpreting them, by owning them, they were taking possession of history itself. They were laying claim to time. I love that insight. And the book is just full of these gems that, my book is totally underlined. But I think, the reader naturally makes a connection to the kinds of interpretations you're doing of these cultural artifacts. And you come out, shortly after that line, you come out with a question yourself, which is it possible to write without plunder? Perhaps that is the more important question than whether any of the writing will last. So one sense is this book is an attempt to interpret without plundering. And it's not necessarily a question you answer directly, whether one can do it. But do you have any further thoughts about that, or did you see the book as an attempt to do that? And what does it mean to write without plundering?
Yeah, the book was certainly an attempt to do that, and I don't think I can be the one to answer whether it succeeded. I think other people can make those judgments. But yeah, it's I mention again and again different, particularly early anthropologists and ethnographers,
Mhm.
not just who were, literally looting plunder from, ancient Mesopotamia, but who were collecting the worldviews and languages of the indigenous people of North America in particular. And one of the things the book tries to explore is the power relations inherent in that kind of collection. And most of those people, certainly, people like like Crosby, who was Ursula Le Guin's dad, who's one of the sort of enormous names of
Mhm.
I'm sorry, Kroeber. It's late here. Of North American ethnography. These were the book, I think, tries to interrogate, I hate that word, but the power relations inherent in those tasks. Like, to what do these men who thought they were doing this great favor to the world by preserving these ways of thinking and seeing the world, were in a way also looting, right? The cultures that they were drawing from. And of course, I'm also drawing from some of these same cultures, and I'm basing my work on some of these same ethnographers, some of these same anthropologists. And I was trying to do it in a way that drew attention to those power relations, and that at least asked the question of, is another way of knowing and relating to the object of one's knowledge possible? Can we do that in prose?
Mhm.
And I tried, and I hope people think I did it.
I mean, I think the book really does wear its uncertainty in a productive way on its sleeve, and challenges itself even in its form on a sort of larger level. So I don't know. I think it's, if not, it is, to my mind, a success, an interesting experiment. And well, one last question, probably the dreaded question. You say you're thinking about another book. Reading this book, it's like, whoa, where does he go with his next one? Is it going to look like this? Is it going to be something else entirely? Can you tell us anything about your thinking about the next one?
Oh,
Or is that just a kind of a sensitive question? I shouldn't do it. I just can't resist.
it's not sensitive. It's just like it's the last thing I want to talk about.
Okay, you don't have to.
I think in some ways it's continuing some of the same questions. I'm going to be really vague and give you an extremely just a vague answer. In some ways, it's continuing some of the very same questions that this book led me to. The big one being, like, how did things get so bad, right? And humans' relationship to the world around them, to the non-human forms of life, has never been as, like, wildly destructive as it has been for the last century and a half. So how do we get here? That's really the big question that I'm still trying to answer, which was in many ways the motivating question of this book too. And so far, this is the book that I'm working on now is much more based just on research, and I don't think it's going to have the same. It won't have the same structure, and I don't think it'll have quite as much of me in it. But that might change in the writing.
Mm-hmm. A different kind of you. Well, Ben, thanks so much for your time. This has been a really wonderful discussion. Thanks for beaming in from so far away. Ben Ehrenreich, everyone. We'll have this video up on our YouTube channel before long, so you can check it out and share it there. And thanks so much. Hope to see everyone in the new year for more events. Thanks also to Devon, who's in behind the scenes doing some important tech work. We appreciate you. Ben, it's been a pleasure.
For me too, Nick. Thanks for all the great questions and for having me on.
Okay, hope to see you again soon, and see you all soon. Appreciate it. Take care.